Have you ever been called useless by someone who should have been thanking you, just because your hands aren't as steady as they used to be? I have, and worse. I heard it from my own son, in front of my grandchildren. He said I was too old to take care of them. What he didn't know was that I had a secret, one that changed everything. Imagine spending your whole life giving of yourself, giving up dreams, quietly building the future of your loved ones, and in the end, being treated like a burden. Today I'm going to tell you how a cutting phrase became the key to a turnaround he never saw coming. And maybe, when you hear this, you'll understand how to protect your dignity before someone else decides for you. Every second counts, because there are words we swallow that leave deep wounds. Stay with me until the end and discover what I did when I realized I no longer needed to ask for permission or affection. You won't believe what happened when he discovered who was the real owner of the house. My name is Rosario Beltran. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived my entire life in Guadalajara. For 36 years, I was a teacher of little children, the kind who still grip their pencil with swapped fingers and look at you as if you were magical. I've been a widow for 8 years. Enrique, my husband, passed away in his sleep, as if saying goodbye softly. Since then, I've kept the simple routine I've always valued, tending my garden, chatting with my neighbor Antonia on Saturday mornings, and most importantly, being there when my children need me, or at least when they say they need me. Camilla, my youngest daughter, calls me every week. She tells me about the busy days at the hospital where she works, her shifts, and the small dramas of life with 2 children. Whenever she asks for help, I go. I love picking up my grandchildren from school, making star-shaped pancakes, and listening to the stories they invent about robots, monsters, and planets with 3 moons. But Fernando has always been different. Distant, formal, as if he were my tenant rather than my son. Yet when he told me he was moving to a bigger house with Rebecca and the boys, I offered to help however they needed. At first, Rebecca seemed surprised. She gave an awkward half smile and said it would be great, but something in her eyes said otherwise. Still, I went. I started staying over on weekends. I'd bring my own pajamas, my tea herbs, and I was happy just to be near the grandchildren. They'd hug me tight when I arrived, as if I were a warm blanket on a rainy day. I washed dishes, folded clothes, read bedtime stories. I never complained, not even when I noticed Fernando barely looked me in the eye. Not when Rebecca began calling me Rosario instead of mother-in-law. That Saturday began like every other. I woke up early, made cinnamon porridge for the children, and swept the driveway. Rebecca rushed out to a cosmetic appointment and stuck a to-do list on the fridge. "If you could take a look," she wrote, as if I were an employee. Still, I did everything. Not for her, nor for Fernando, but because my grandchildren deserved to grow up in a clean, light environment. I believed somehow that effort would be recognized. At night, Fernando arrived. He'd been out with coworkers. He sat on the couch, turned on the TV, and called me over. I thought he wanted to talk, maybe thank me. But when I approached, he said coldly, as one gives an order to a stranger, "Mom, you can no longer care for the children. You're old. We need someone younger, more efficient." I froze. His words hit me like a door slamming shut. He didn't even look at me properly. He said it in front of the boys and Rebecca, who crossed her arms and nodded. My legs wobbled. My face burned. Not from fever, but from shame. I didn't reply. I simply went to the guest room, packed my things in silence, and carefully folded the little blanket the children used when they slept on my lap. My heart trembled more than my hands. I thought of Camilla, thought of my mother, who always said, "Rosario, never humiliate yourself for someone who doesn't see the value of what you give in silence." And it was in that silence that I decided to leave. Before I left, I passed through the living room without saying a word. I just wanted to grab my coat which was in the hallway closet, but when I opened the door, I noticed a brown envelope on the floor. It was a document, probably forgotten. I bent to pick it up, and when I saw what it was, my body froze. It was a debt notice, not on the house, but in Fernando's name. A heavy debt with a mortgage guarantee on that very house, the house that, legally, was mine. There I stood in the hallway, between the dinosaur-patterned play rug and the smell of cheap disinfectant, and I understood that the humiliation wasn't everything. Something far more serious was happening, and perhaps, for the first time in years, I needed to step out of the role of the doting grandmother and remember who I am, who I was, because it wasn't just my dignity at stake. It was my grandchildren's future too. I stood there for a few seconds, envelope in hand, head spinning. I recalled every penny I'd saved over the last 20 years, the snacks I'd skipped, the clothes I'd mended, the modest house I'd chosen to live in so as not to weigh on anyone's shoulders. When my mother died, she left me a small sum, enough for me to buy a property. I did it quietly, not out of pride, but because I thought that if my children ever needed help, I could give it without it becoming a bargaining chip. Fernando approached me months ago, saying he and Rebecca were tired of renting, that the boys needed more space. I suggested he choose a house and leave the paperwork to me. I bought it in my name. I handed him the key with a smile and a hug. He never asked how I'd managed it, never properly thanked me, and I, foolishly, thought his silence was respect. In truth, it was convenience. He thought I would, as always, stay in my corner, quiet and ready to serve. I returned to the bedroom and sat on the bed. The children slept in the room next door. I heard the little one's heavy breathing. The sound gave me strength. I pulled out my phone and texted Camilla, "Daughter, tomorrow I'm coming home. Will you pick me up in the morning?" She replied in under 2 minutes, "Of course, Mom. What happened?" But I still had no words. I tucked the envelope in my bag, took a deep breath, and turned off the light. The next morning, Camilla arrived early, hair hastily tied up, worry in her eyes. She hugged me tight at the door. Fernando didn't come downstairs. Rebecca appeared in a robe and just said, "Buenos dias," with a dry little smile. I didn't look at her. I got into the car with Camilla and, on the way, I told her everything. She held my hand as she drove and said, "Mom, what he did is unforgivable." And for the first time in years, I saw not only empathy in her eyes, but outrage. In the days that followed, I stayed home, in my corner, reflecting. I watered the plants, drank my teas, and left the envelope on the kitchen table. Every day it stared back at me, a silent reminder of what I needed to do. I didn't want to act out of anger, but I also couldn't keep erasing myself so others could shine. My grandchildren lived in that house, and if Fernando lost everything because of that debt, if they ended up on the street, the truth was I didn't know how deep the hole went, but I knew I'd sink with it if I did nothing. On Friday, I went to the notary office with all the documents. I requested an updated copy of the title deed. The house was still in my name, and no changes had been made, which meant the mortgage was technically invalid. Fernando had tried to secure a loan with a house that didn't legally belong to him. I left there with my stomach in knots, not just because of him, but because of myself. How could I have trusted so blindly and erased myself so completely? I returned home and sat on the sofa. I grabbed an old notebook and started writing everything I knew. Dates, amounts, phrases he'd said in recent months. I began piecing together a puzzle I was part of, but where no one had given me a voice. For the first time in a long time, I felt I was reclaiming something that was rightfully mine, my position. Not as the owner, but as a woman with history, memory, and worth. That evening, Camilla came over with pumpkin soup and homemade bread. We sat together like in the old days, and she said, "Mom, do you want me to come with you to talk to him?" I shook my head. "Not yet," I replied. I needed to think, to understand the next step, because in this story now, I held the key. On Saturday morning, I woke to birdsong and a lump in my throat. I made my coffee with milk, as always, but left the cup untouched. The envelope was open on the table alongside my notebook of notes. The morning sun shone on it, as if the universe wanted to remind me I could no longer ignore it. I tried to distract myself by watering the plants, but my thoughts kept returning to the same place: my grandchildren. What would happen to them if that debt went through? And if I were the only one who could prevent it? I picked up the phone and called a lawyer, a calm gentleman with a deep voice, who'd been my husband's colleague at City Hall. I explained everything carefully. He listened in silence for nearly 20 minutes, then said, "Rosario, the house is yours. And what your son did? It's serious, but you still have control." I wrote down his recommendations. He suggested I call Fernando for a conversation before any legal action. He said that perhaps a clear talk could avoid a scandal. But he also warned me, don't let them use your goodwill against you. I spent the rest of Saturday gathering the courage to face my own son. I reviewed what I would say, imagined his reactions, considered every possible version of the dialogue. But deep down, I knew nothing would truly prepare me. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about respect, about the place he thought I deserved, and about the place I was finally deciding to reclaim. On Sunday, I went to their house. I took a bag of toys the children had left with me. I knocked on the gate and Rebecca appeared, visibly annoyed. "Rosario, you didn't warn me you were coming," I simply replied. "I need to speak with Fernando, alone." She hesitated, then let me in. Minutes later, he came to the gate, wearing shorts and a t-shirt, impatience on his face. "What now, Mom?" As if I were just another inconvenience in his weekend. I asked to come in. We sat on the porch. The children played in the backyard. I took a deep breath and got straight to the point. I pulled the envelope from my bag and placed it on the table between us. "You tried to mortgage a house that isn't yours, Fernando. It's in my name. And you knew that." He turned pale. He tried to laugh it off as just a formality, that everything was under control. But I saw on his face, it wasn't. He was in trouble, and he'd tried to use me without telling me. I calmly explained that I knew everything, that I'd checked with the notary, that I'd spoken with a lawyer, and that, from that moment on, nothing would proceed without my authorization, that he needed to find another solution for his debt, and that I was no longer the submissive mother he thought he could manipulate. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then he stood up abruptly and went inside without saying goodbye. He left the gate open. I took that as a clear response. I returned home with a heavy heart, but for the first time in years, feeling whole. Camilla called me later and I told her what happened. She was proud. She said that if I needed anything, she'd be by my side. That night I slept better than I had in a long time, without fear, without doubt, just with a new feeling. Freedom. The next morning, I received an unexpected message from Rebecca. It was short, curt, but revealing. "You could have spoken to us first, but now I understand everything." I took a deep breath and deleted the message. Sometimes, silence is also an answer. And at this point in life, I had learned that not everything needs a response. Some things just need to end. On Tuesday, I got up early and went to the bank. I asked to speak with the manager about any risks related to that debt. I showed the house documents and the attempted mortgage. He confirmed what the lawyer had said. As long as the property was in my name, no legal guarantee could be enforced. I left there with lighter shoulders, but at the same time I felt an ache in my chest that wasn't just legal. It was emotional. It was the weight of realizing my own son saw me as a resource, not as a person. I decided then to change the course. I ordered a duplicate of the deed with notarized signatures and kept it at home with a note so that, if anything happened to me, Camilla would know exactly what to do. It wasn't paranoia. It was prevention. Living so long as an invisible woman taught me that when women like me disappear, No one asks where they kept their papers, but at that moment, I would no longer accept being invisible. I had a name, an ID number, and a registered deed. That same week, I saw my grandchildren after school. Camilla was on duty and asked for my help. I agreed immediately. When they saw me at the gate, they ran to me with their little arms wide, shouting, "Grandma!" It melted me inside. I wasn't doing this for revenge. It was for them, for those little eyes that don't know much but feel everything. I spent the afternoon with them in the park, laughing, telling stories, trying in some way to preserve the childhood their father might be eroding with his mistakes. On the way home, the older one, 6 years old, said from the back seat, "Daddy was mad. Will you sleep at our house again, Grandma?" I swallowed hard, smiled and replied, "Now Grandma has her own house, but you can visit anytime." He nodded, a bit confused. The little one was already asleep, mouth open, clutching his dinosaur toy. In that moment, I decided I needed to secure a place for them, a refuge, a corner where love was pure, without debts or demands. And if I couldn't be heard as a mother, then I would be heard as a grandmother. In the following days, I began adapting my house. I turned the back room into an improvised playroom. I hung colorful curtains, placed children's books, and scattered floor cushions. I bought an old radio and played boleros softly, the same ones that filled my Sundays with Enrique. I wanted the boys to have good memories there, memories different from the muffled fights and contempt they might be noting in their parents' home. Camilla brought them to my house on Saturday mornings. At first, Fernando didn't come, but gradually I saw the boys more relaxed, more cheerful. They started bringing drawings they'd made for me, telling me school news, asking to sleep over here. I gladly obliged. I set up a mattress on my bedroom floor, like during childhood camping clubs. Their laughter at night filled the spaces that once held silence and hurt. One night, while tucking them in, the older said, "Daddy yells a lot now, but Mommy says you're good, and you took care of us so well." Tears welled in my eyes, not from pity, but because at last, in the chaos, the truth was finding its way to those littles. I knew I couldn't shield them from everything, but I could be a beacon, steady, constant, even in their storms. I started writing down little things they said in a notebook. Things they said, funny questions, spontaneous comments. It was my way of preserving memories and reminding myself that love survives, even between the lines. One day, the younger asked, "Grandma, why is your hair white?" Before I could answer, he said, "It's because you have magic, right?" I smiled, throat tight. Because deep down, that was exactly it. Surviving rejection and still loving. Maybe that really was a kind of magic. On a sunny Sunday, Rebecca arrived with a carrot cake and sat with me in the yard. We spoke little, but honestly. She said Fernando was in therapy. She told me he lacked the courage to approach me, but was quieter, more thoughtful. He feels shame, Rosario, but he doesn't yet know what to do with it. I listened carefully. I didn't say I forgave him, nor that I didn't. I simply said, I hope he learns to see himself, because I've already learned to see myself. The following week, Camilla took me to a craft fair. I set up a booth with my paintings just for fun, but to my surprise, 2 canvases sold. One lady said, "There's so much life here. Whoever painted this knows things." I thanked her with a shy smile. I didn't share my story. I didn't need to. Sometimes art speaks for us in ways words cannot. At the end of the month, I received a letter, handwritten, from Fernando. He said he didn't know how to fix what he'd done but wanted to try, that he was in therapy, remembered the stories I told in childhood, and missed me. I read each line slowly, without rush. My heart didn't race, but something inside warmed. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he asked for presence. And that, coming from him, was a beginning I never expected. I tucked the letter away next to old photos in my drawer, next to a picture of young Fernando holding a flower he'd picked from my garden. Perhaps life is indeed a cycle of losses and reunions, but now, for the first time, I was no longer at the center of waiting. I was the choice of myself, and from then on, every step would be taken with consciousness and self-love. That same day, after putting the letter away, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap and watched the sky darken. The jasmine scent rose on the breeze, and I felt whole. Not because I'd won a battle, but because I finally understood I no longer had to bear others' burdens on my shoulders. For years, I accepted crumbs of affection, thinking that was all I deserved. Now I knew what I deserve is what I choose to accept. On Monday, when I opened the gate to get the newspaper, I saw Fernando standing there with a bouquet of lilies. I can't remember the last time he gave me flowers. Maybe he never had. We stood staring at each other for a few seconds. "May I come in?" he asked softly. I nodded. We sat on the living room sofa, words unspoken, the lilies on the table. He said, I was wrong, and only now do I understand how much. I took a deep breath and told him he didn't have to convince me of anything, because time had already shown me all I needed. "You didn't lose me because of the debt, Fernando. You lost me when you decided my age was a defect, when you treated me like a burden, not like a mother." He nodded, eyes glistening, and for the first time since it all began, he listened, without interrupting, without justifying. He simply heard. And in that silence, something new began to grow. We stayed there for over an hour. He spoke of childhood, of his father, of workplace pressures, of fears he hadn't even admitted to himself. He said he felt like a failure and took it out on those closest to him. I didn't want to see, but when you left, it was as if the house lost its smell of home. That touched me, because deep down I always knew. Often what holds a family together is the silent love of the one no one sees until they're gone. That night, Fernando didn't ask to regain control. He didn't beg me to forget. He asked only one thing, that I allow the children to see their grandmother without intermediaries, that he himself could bring them, sit with me sometimes, try to rebuild what remained. I said yes, but with one condition. You will respect me from now on, not as the helping mother, but as the woman I am. He nodded, and not just with his head, with his eyes. For the first time, I felt truth there. The following Saturday, Fernando showed up with the boys. He brought empanadas, juice, and a timid smile. They spent the afternoon with me in the yard, helping to pick herbs and water plants. The boys seemed lighter, as if they sensed something good was being mended among the adults. Fernando was mostly silent, but his gestures spoke volumes. He served me tea, washed dishes without being asked, and before leaving said, "Thank you, Mom." That night, I wrote another page in my diary. I recorded everything, and I finished with a sentence that came without thought. Sometimes the justice we expect comes in the form of presence. It doesn't fix the past, but it honors who we've become. I closed the notebook with steady hands and a calm heart. I no longer carried resentments, only lessons, and among them, the greatest. No one can take from you what you've built inside yourself. In the days that followed, my routine once again smelled of normality, but it was a new normal, built with conscious choices, clear boundaries, love that doesn't erase itself to fit. I continued painting, welcoming the grandchildren, tending the garden. Sometimes Fernando would come by with a book, a question, a gentler look. We weren't the same, but we were trying to be something more sincere. And for me, that was a victory greater than any forced reconciliation. One Wednesday afternoon, while making corn cake with the boys, the older looked at me and asked, "Grandma, are you always happy now?" That question surprised me. I smiled and replied, "Not always, but today I choose to be." He continued stirring the batter as if he hadn't said anything remarkable, but that phrase echoed in me, because it was true. For the first time in a long time, I felt I could choose how to feel, not just react to what others did to me. I began to notice my home gaining a new energy, not just from the colors of my paintings on the walls, nor the constant scent of fresh herbs in the kitchen. It was something deeper, a lightness in the air, a peace that came from knowing I no longer owed anyone anything, neither explanations nor invisible sacrifices. And this feeling, little by little, gave me a greater will to live, truly, without hiding behind the role of the selfless mother. Camilla noticed it too. One day, as we had coffee, she said, "Mom, you look more beautiful." And I laughed. "Beautiful? With this white hair and these dark circles from waking up at 5? She shook her head. "Not outside. You've learned to see yourself again." And it was true. I was seeing myself again, not as someone who serves, but as someone who exists, who feels, who paints, who plants, who decides. Soon after, I received an invitation to exhibit some of my canvases at the municipal library. It was a small show, only 3 paintings, but to me it felt like winning an award. I took the grandchildren with me on installation day. They ran between the shelves, curious while I spoke with the curator. When they saw my paintings on the wall, they clapped and said, "Those are Grandma's." I almost cried right there, because behind the paint were decades of silence, transformed into color. On the day of the exhibition, Fernando came. He arrived mid-afternoon, alone, wearing a pressed shirt and eyes lowered. He walked slowly to where I stood and examined each painting carefully. When he reached the last one, titled "Broken Roots," he paused for a long moment. Then he turned to me and said, "I understand." Just that. And it was enough. Because sometimes, understanding is the greatest apology someone can give. In the months that followed, we continued rebuilding our bond, not without difficulties. Sometimes he still got lost in his silences, and I still felt the old reflex of wanting to please. But now I knew how to interrupt that cycle. I knew when to stop, when to say no, and he began to respect that. He began to listen more, to offer more, to show presence without intruding. Gradually, the wound started to heal. The scar remained, of course, but it no longer hurt. One Sunday, we all sat together in my yard. Camilla, Fernando, Rebecca, the boys, even their dog. I made rice with chicken and mango salad. The table was full of people, conversation, new memories. At one point, Fernando raised a makeshift toast with orange juice and said, "To Grandma Rosario, who never stopped being the heart of our family, even when we had no eyes to see." I held back tears, because now it was no longer pain. It was recognition. That night, I wrote the final page in my diary. I closed it with the sense of a mission accomplished, and I decided something important. That diary would be kept for the grandchildren. One day, when they're old enough, they will read it all. They'll know not only of the grandmother who baked cakes and told stories, but of the woman who rose from contempt, rebuilt her dignity, and turned silence into presence. The following week, while sorting through old papers, I found a note in Enrique's handwriting, my late husband's. It was a yellowed page, folded inside a cookbook. "Rosario, you are the silent foundation of everything we have. One day, our children will understand." I read it with a lump in my throat. It wasn't just a note. It was a reminder. Enrique saw me in a way few others did. And there, in that forgotten scrap of paper, was the reflection of the woman he knew I was, even when I had forgotten. I took the note to the photo of him in my living room shelf. I placed the paper beside it, as if returning that strength to its source. I stood there in silence for a few minutes. Sometimes you don't need words, just gratitude, because some love continues to sustain you, even after someone leaves. Enrique was that kind of love, and with that love inside me, I continued facing whatever came. Fernando started visiting me every Wednesday afternoon, unannounced. Sometimes he'd bring sweet bread. Other times he'd just sit and listen. He began asking about my childhood, about my marriage, about how I handled loneliness after his father's death. He listened with genuine attention, as if meeting me for the first time, and I too began to see something new in him. a desire to be better, not to please me, but for himself, and that was more valuable than any apology. One day he asked me, "Mom, did you ever want to disappear?" I chuckled softly. So many times, but never out of cowardice, always out of exhaustion. He remained silent, then said, "I never imagined you got tired." That broke me, because there was the root of it all. He thought I was made of iron, that my care was automatic, that my love had no limits. And now, finally, he was beginning to see that behind the strength was a woman with aches, desires, and choices. The next Friday, Rebecca showed up with a lavender plant. "It's for your porch. I thought it suited your scent." I laughed, surprised. I never thought she'd be capable of such a tender gesture. I thanked her and invited her for coffee. We talked about simple things. The children, routines, postponed dreams. I realized she too carried wounds. Not like mine, but similar in origin. A lack of being heard, the weight of expectations, the fear of not being enough. After Rebecca left, I watched the plant on the table. The lavender exuded a calm, almost maternal aroma. And in that moment, I understood that forgiveness isn't erasing what happened. It's giving space for something new to grow. Something that doesn't wipe away the past, but re-signifies it. And I was ready for that. Not to erase the pain, but to live beyond it. I began writing letters to myself. Little notes with phrases I wish I'd heard on hard days. You are not invisible. Your worth doesn't diminish with age. Being firm isn't the same as being harsh. I stuck these messages on the mirror, the fridge, inside books. They were reminders from me to me. Small rescues of the woman who'd been forgotten among chores and silences. And little by little, that woman learned to breathe deeply again and allow herself to live without fear. At the end of the month, I received an unexpected invitation. A group of former teachers from my school was organizing a discussion circle on aging with autonomy. They wanted me as a guest speaker. I was surprised. Me, who had spent so many years thinking I had nothing to say. But I accepted, because now I knew my story wasn't small. And if at least one woman heard it and recognized herself, it would have been worth it. The day of the circle arrived, and I wore a long blue skirt and a linen blouse Camilla gave me for my last birthday. When I arrived, there were over 30 women seated in a circle, of different ages and stories. Some used canes, others came with granddaughters, others alone. I sat among them with a racing heart, not because I was nervous about speaking, but because I felt that, for the first time, I was about to speak of my pain as something with a name, a place, and value. When they handed me the microphone, I took a deep breath, and I told my story, not as a complaint, nor as seeking pity. I spoke as someone who survived. I spoke of what it is to care for everyone and forget oneself, of being discarded with words that hurt more than slaps, of looking in the mirror and not recognizing oneself until the day one decides to return to oneself. When I finished, I noticed many women crying silently. One beside me held my hand and said, "Thank you. That's what I needed to hear." After the circle, several came to hug me. Others shared their own stories. Ungrateful children, husbands who silenced them, grandchildren who were pushed away. The pain was different for each, but there was a common point. All had, at some moment, forgotten they had a voice. And now, there, they were catching their breath. It was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. I left feeling lighter, stronger, and with a new certainty. My story doesn't end at 69. Perhaps it's only just beginning. On the way home, I found the boys at the gate with Camilla. They had drawn a chalk poster that read, "Welcome back, brave grandma." I almost cried. I hugged them tight, feeling that all I had lived had meaning. Because if they, so small, already learned to value courage over silence, then something was changing, and that change was my greatest legacy. A few days later, a young journalist from the local paper visited. She'd heard about the circle and wanted to Write a short piece on women who start over after 60. We talked for more than an hour. She was impressed by the story of the house, the debt, the silence, and the turnaround. At the end, she asked permission to publish. I hesitated for a moment, then said, "Go ahead. Just don't forget to say that we're never too old to remember who we are." The article ran under the headline, "Rosario Beltran. At 69, she discovered she could begin again." When I saw my name in the paper, I felt a mix of embarrassment and pride. I called Camila, and she laughed. "You're famous now, Mom." And I laughed too, because it wasn't fame. It was acknowledgement. It was as if for a moment the world looked at me and said, "Sorry for ignoring you." After that, some neighbors began to seek me out. One 82-year-old lady told me she cried herself to sleep because her children left her with a caregiver who didn't even speak to her. Another, 74, said she'd given her house to her grandson and now was treated like a guest. Hearing it all, I realized that what happened to me was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle made of women who loved so much they forgot to demand love in return. And that day, for the first time, I thought of something I'd never imagined. Perhaps I could turn my story into a tool. Maybe I could write a book with these accounts, or start a support group, not to denounce anyone, but to remind other women there's still time, always time. And even if no one told us that in our 40s, 50s, or 60s, we can tell each other now. I began jotting ideas in a new red-covered notebook. I wrote at the top of the first page, "For those who were silenced and yet remained." Each day I noted a memory, a phrase, a story someone had told me. The words flowed with a strength I hadn't felt since I taught writing. It was as if I'd finally given shape to what had been kept inside my chest for years. It was no longer just my story. It was a mirror for many. Camila supported me in everything. She said seeing this new version of me was like seeing a flower reborn after winter. Fernando, for his part, read some of my notes in silence when he visited. He didn't comment, but sometimes left a bookmark between the pages, as if to say, "I was here." I no longer demanded any restitution from him, because I understood that some wounds aren't healed. They are transformed if you allow them to be. One Saturday morning, Rebecca called me, voice trembling. "Rosario, may I come over? I'm feeling lost." I said yes. When she arrived, her eyes were puffy and her hands shaking. She sat on my sofa and broke down. She told me about the exhaustion, Fernando's yelling, how she'd become too harsh trying to be strong. For the first time, I saw not a rival, but a woman trying not to disappear. And in that moment, I offered what I had most precious, listening. We talked for hours. I gave no advice. I just held space. In the end, she hugged me and said, "Thank you for hating me." And I replied, "I've hated myself too much already to waste energy hating another woman." In her eyes, I saw something new, relief, and perhaps there we began to rebuild a trust that never truly existed, but now could be born, the right way. The next day, I took the grandchildren to the park and sat on a bench with a book in my lap. As they ran after pigeons and laughed, an older woman approached and said, "You're Rosario from the newspaper, right?" I smiled and confirmed. She sat by me and said, "I read your story. You gave me the courage to say no for the first time in 7 years." We talked like old friends for an hour, and in that moment I was certain my pain had become a bridge. That same week I was invited to an interview on the local radio. I almost refused, afraid of exposing myself too much, but something inside me said, "Go. Go for all those who couldn't." I went, and I told everything, my voice steady. At the end, the host said, "Rosario, you're inspiring. So many people. You're needed." And for the first time, I didn't deny it. I just smiled and said, "Maybe now I think I'm needed too." Fernando heard the interview. He sent me a brief message, as he always did. I cried. Just that. And this time, it was enough. Because it was no longer about him acknowledging me. It was about him seeing himself too. about him understanding that wounds inflicted in silence can become deep scars, and that asking for forgiveness doesn't erase everything, but shows that the person has finally removed the blindfold. That night, I sat with Camilla in the kitchen, and we talked about everything that was happening. She took my hand and said, "Mom, you've become a beacon." I laughed and asked, "A beacon?" She explained, "For me, for Rebecca, for Fernando, for the boys, even for those women you don't know. You've become light." And perhaps then, I wept not from pain, nor exhaustion. I wept from recognition, and that indeed is a cleansing cry, one that heals and renews. A few days later, I took the boys out for lunch. We chose a simple diner with plastic tables and the smell of French fries in the air. They were ecstatic, as if it were a grand event, and maybe it was. Every simple moment now held new weight. It was more than a meal. It was a celebration of presence, freedom, and rebuilding. They laughed loudly, told me school secrets, and I listened as if trying to store every detail in my heart. When we returned, we found Fernando sitting on the porch. "Step." He stood and looked at the boys, then at me. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded. We sat, the three of us, me, him, and the boys, in the living room where once there was only awkward silence. Fernando took an envelope from his pocket. "It's a letter I wrote to you, but I'm not sure I want you to read it now," I replied. "There's no rush. Healing has no deadline." The boys, sensing it was important, lay on the floor and began drawing in silence. That night, after everyone left, I opened the envelope. The letter was long, handwritten, with crossed-out passages and rewritten lines. He wrote of childhood, of memories with me, how small he felt, realizing the harm he'd caused. He said he wanted to be a better son from now on, even if I no longer accepted that role. "I want to be someone you're proud to know, even if not as mother and son, even if as two people choosing to start over." I cried for his honesty, humility, and the possibility. The following Saturday, I took this you're reading right now to the women's group. I found it at the community center. I read it aloud, my voice trembling at times but never stopping. Some cried, others applauded. At the end, a woman named Lydia hugged me and said, "Rosario, you gave me courage to leave the room I'd been trapped in for 7 years." I held her hand and said, "Then it was all worth it." I returned home with my heart ablaze. I felt that, somehow, my path of pain and silence had become something greater. And perhaps that really is the mission of our stories, to become roads for those still in the dark, to know that what almost destroyed me now stands as support for other women to rise. Over time, Fernando's visits became natural. Sometimes he'd come just to have coffee and talk. Other times he'd bring school books and ask me to recount what it was like to be a teacher back then. He listened with genuine interest, as if discovering me anew. And I too began to see something new in him, a desire to be better, not to please me, but for himself. And that was more precious than any apology. Camilla, ever present, helped me organize group meetings, tend the garden, prepare snacks for the grandchildren. Our relationship, already strong, grew even more so. She often said, "Mom, if I become half of what you are, I'll be an incredible woman." And I told her she already was, because Camilla was my anchor when everything seemed to collapse. And even in my silent days, she reminded me there was still love possible. One day, sitting on the porch, Camilla asked, "Do you regret anything, Mom?" I thought for a few seconds and replied, "I regret accepting so little for so long, but I don't regret having loved, even when love hurt. It taught me something." She nodded and hugged me like she did as a child, and I knew right then that what felt like an end was just a new beginning. The next month, I was surprised with an invitation from the city hall itself. My paintings would be displayed in a collective exhibition called Silent Voices, focused on women over 60. It was too symbolic to be coincidence. Me, who for so long had silenced myself to keep others' peace, would now have my colors exhibited as a form of expression. I was moved alone, torn between disbelief and gratitude. That was more than art. It was living proof that there are still possible paths. A few days later, Fernando sent me a photo of the boys practicing music. "They're rehearsing to perform for you on Saturday," he wrote. "And they kept that promise. They arrived here with a small keyboard and 2 folding chairs. Rebecca brought empanadas, Camila came with juice, and the house filled with laughter. When they played Las Mañanitas with unsteady fingers, I cried as one watches the miracle of new beginnings. Not for the sound, but for the gesture. It was as if each note said, 'You are still at the center of it all.'" Later, alone, I opened my old diary. I read the first pages marked by anguish, resentment, and feeling. Discarded, but gradually the tone shifted, growing firmer, more alive, more mine. I closed the notebook carefully, placed it beside Fernando's letter and Enrique's old note. That little shrine became my sanctuary, my reminder that pain can end, and an end can be the beginning of something far greater. On Sunday, while preparing lunch, I received a message from an elder named Ophelia, who'd participated in my community group. "Rosario, after your story, I had the courage to say no for the first time in 40 years. I read it, stunned. I realized then that my story, the same that almost made me disappear, was now helping other women reappear. And that, to me, was true restitution." Soon after, Fernando visited without the boys. We sat on the porch in silence until he said, "I think I had to lose your trust to realize what it meant." I calmly replied, "You didn't lose it, but understand that now I have boundaries." He nodded, head bowed. He was no longer a son asking for comfort, but a man, learning anew. And even though much remained to be done, in that moment, I felt he saw me. That same week, I was invited to write a monthly column for the local newspaper on aging without erasing yourself. I accepted. My first column was titled, "Not Everything We Endure Should Be Endured." It was a success. Women began sending letters, notes, even drawings. It was as if, by naming my wounds, I'd created a space where others could heal too. When my 70th birthday arrived, I decided on a small home gathering. Nothing grand, just people who truly stayed. Camila made my favorite cake. Rebecca brought purple flowers. The boys handmade cards. Fernando gave a timid but sincere toast. In that simple yard, full of laughter, I realized I didn't need complete forgiveness to move forward, just honesty. After everyone left, I washed dishes in silence, warm water on my hands, the lingering cake scent, and a new peace in my chest. I looked around and realized this was my house, of choices, built not of a home for the affections that treat me as a whole person, not as an afterthought. Today, when I look back, I see the woman who was told by her own son she was too old to care for her grandchildren. And I think she survived. And more than that, she flourished, not out of revenge nor pride, but because she chose to return to herself. And that choice changed everything. If you've read this far, perhaps you understand what I mean. Sometimes the turning point begins the day we say, "Enough." Mine began in that moment of humiliation and continued down a path of silence, difficult decisions, and quiet tears, but also of reunions, listening, and healing. And today I can say without fear, I am not just a mother or a grandmother or someone who helps. I am Rosario, and now I see myself, I hear myself, I belong to myself. Sometimes all we need is an instant of courage to leave where we were dimmed and return to existing on our own terms. If your presence diminish or your silence become routine, know you're not alone. There are many of us trying every day to reclaim our own voices, even if our hearts still ache. If this story touched you in some way, tell me, or share it with someone who may be living the same process, but still can't name it. And if you want to keep hearing real stories like this one, of people who fell, but chose to rise with dignity, stay with us here, because sometimes the strength someone needs to take the next step is knowing someone somewhere already took it and survived to tell the tale.